Today on Better Book Clubs, how I did on my 2022 reading goals and the one category I missed. So for the past couple of years, I've been setting a reading goal that has to do with a diversity of genres in my reading habits rather than the number of books I'm reading. So I did this last year as well, and I crunched the numbers at the end of the year, and what I discovered was that I did read a lot fewer books than usual. I read only slightly more than half as many books as I would normally have read in a year, but I read pretty much the same number of pages. So what that means is I've been reading more longer books that maybe subconsciously I was kind of avoiding before when I was counting the number of books I was reading, because I knew that they were going to take me longer and maybe hold me back from my goal. It's a ridiculous thing to be thinking about when you're reading, or a really bad way of choosing books. So I'm really glad I stopped counting books. But what I am paying attention to now, or at least what I'm setting as a goal now at the beginning of each year, is the categories in which I want to read. So I set myself 8 categories for 2022, and then I don't really pay much attention to them. I kind of read as I'm going, whatever I feel like reading. And I checked in on my list a couple of times to see how I was doing, and it might have influenced a couple of choices I made along the way. But it's time now to kind of take a look back at what those 8 categories were that I said I wanted to read in this year, and to talk about the one category that I missed and why that's a problem. So one of the categories that I set for this year was to read history. It wasn't that hard for me. I almost always read at least one history book every year. And this year, that book was Will in the World by Stephen Greenblatt. I really enjoyed this book. It's about Shakespeare, but it's not a biography, and it's not really literary criticism or an analysis of the plays. It really is more a history of Shakespeare's time. This was one of my favorite reads this year. The subtitle is How Shakespeare Became Shakespeare, and so it really talks about the world in which Shakespeare was writing. I learned a lot, actually, about particularly how intense the Catholic Protestant violence was, and some things around how scary it was to actually be writing at that time, how brave Shakespeare actually was as a playwright, which was something I had never fully appreciated before. So this was my history read for the year, and it was the only history book I really read this year, but it was a great choice. The second category I wanted to read in this year was a book in translation, and that turned out to be a classic novel by Nikolai Gogol called Dead Souls. I read this because there's a group on Goodreads that I read with sometimes that was reading it, and I've always meant to read Gogol and never have. So this was a good choice for a read with that group. I don't think I would have enjoyed this so much if I had read it by myself, because it's kind of a quirky novel in some ways, especially when it gets to the second volume, which isn't really finished. I chose with some of the group to really pretty much end my reading at the end of volume 1. It was an interesting read. There were parts of it that I really enjoyed. There were parts of it that were even comical, which surprised me. Of course, I was reading this in translation. I happened to be reading a translation by the same translators, Richard Pavir and Larissa Volokonsky, who translated the Anna Karenina that I read a few years ago, and I really liked their translation. So this was my book in translation. It was the only one, again, that I read this year in translation, but I think that's an important category to include, because so many books get written in languages other than English. So it's great to pay attention to some of those books that are coming out of other languages, and maybe really excellent reads that we otherwise don't pay so much attention to. A third category that I'm actually still reading, but that qualifies for this year, is a book called Shadow of the Silk Road by Colin Tubran. And this is a really fascinating, it's basically a travel journal in a sense, but what he's doing is following the trail of the Silk Road, starting in China and moving west. And I keep referring back to the map at the beginning. There's actually a couple of maps at the beginning that show you the route he's taking. This book meets my criteria for this year of reading a nonfiction book about a place that I don't know much about. Interestingly, this is the only nonfiction book I read that meets this criteria, but I did read a lot of fiction this year that was set in other countries other than the United States where I live. So I went back and I counted those up too, just out of curiosity, even though that wasn't one of the things I was striving to do. I read fiction set in India, Ghana, Russia, Belgium, and then of course England and America. I covered a lot of ground in my fiction reading, just not so much in my nonfiction. Another criteria I had on my list this year was to read a book that I've been planning to read for a long time. And if you're anything like me, you have a really tall TBR stack. Mine, in fact, is right over here next to my bookshelf, and it's almost as tall as the shelf is. And so one of the books that's been sitting in that pile for a really long time is Thomas Hardy's classic novel, Tess of the D'Urbervilles. I had read it before, as you can see by how beat up my copy is, but I think I was probably about 20 years old when I read it a really long time ago, and so it's almost like coming to it completely new again. And I had just been thinking about it a lot and wanting to reread it. So this book, which was also one of my favorite reads of the year, qualifies as the book that I was planning to read for a long time and finally got around to in 2022. And while we're on the subject of classics, I also had on my list to read a classic that I hadn't read before. And this one was really fun. I read Thackeray's Vanity Fair for the first time this year, and I read it with a group of friends. It's a really long book, as you can see. I just wasn't sure that I was gonna stick with it if I read it by myself, and I probably would have because I really enjoyed it. But what really made it fun was reading it with my husband and a couple of other friends and checking in with them every 100 pages or so. In fact, my husband and I made a series of videos in which we talked about the book as we were reading it, and I'll link to those below. Again, like, there's comedy in here that I wasn't expecting. And then at the end, we rented the movie that stars Reese Witherspoon as Becky Sharp, and it was really fun to watch that, having read the book. I also had on my list to read a poetry collection this year. And this was a little bit of a cheat, honestly, because I'm pretty sure I started reading this poetry collection in 2021 and just never finished it. But this is An American Sunrise by Joy Harjo. I did finish reading it this year, and you might be like, well, what? It's not that long. But often when I'm reading poetry, I don't sit down and read it cover to cover like I would another book. It often sits on my bedside table, and I'll just dip in and read 2 or 3 poems at a time and then put it down again. So I finished the collection in 2022. It's the only poetry collection I read this year. Joy Harjo is Poet Laureate of the United States, or at least was at the time that this was published. If you're interested in trying some poetry, I would recommend this collection. It was very well received. And in fact, there were some big reads, like citywide reads of it happening at the time that it came out a couple of years ago. And Harjo is writing about her people, the Muskoka people, and kind of returning to their homeland and talking about not only her heritage, but also our country today. So there's a lot going on in here that I think is really contemporary and important and interesting if you're looking for some contemporary poetry to try. I don't have a copy of the book that I read for the 7th category, which was to read a prize-winning book. I said I was going to read prize-winning books from 2021, but I kind of had the timing off because it turns out I had already read a couple of those, several of those. What I ended up reading this year was a 2022 prize winner, Ruth Ozecki's novel, The Book of Form and Emptiness, which won the Women's Prize for Fiction. And I don't have a copy of that to show you because I took that out of the library. Honestly, that was not my favorite book of the year. I enjoyed it, but if I was, pressed to pick my top 2 or 3 books out of everything I read this year, I don't think that that one would really be the one that it didn't really blow me away, I guess. So I enjoyed it. That's the only book I read that was a prize winner for 2022. One of the things I'm really going to work on for the next year is to read more current fiction, like brand new fiction. Because what tends to happen, as you can see from some of the books I've showed you already, I tend to read a lot of classics and also books that have been sitting in my pile for a long time and I've been meaning to read. So they're always a few years old at least, if not 150 years old. And I don't really keep up with the newest books as much as I would like to. So a friend and I have an idea for this coming year about a different kind of format for a book club that would help us read a little bit more immediately than we do. I'm not sure yet whether we're going to follow through on that, but if we do, I'll make a separate video on that and I'll link to it in the description below. If we end up actually following through on this idea, I'll give you a whole video on how it works. So those are 7 of my 8 criteria that I set up for 2022. The 8th one is the one that I did not accomplish this year. And again, I said earlier in the video that I didn't really sit down and like carefully follow my list. I just kind of made the list and then I thought, we'll see what happens. You know, we'll see whether, if I just kind of keep it in the back of my mind, whether I just become a broader reader. So that 8th category that I didn't read in this year was a feel-good book. I think what I meant by that was just a book that was like a light, happy book that was going to make me feel good. And of course that stemmed directly from being amidst the pandemic. So it was going to be light, maybe like a beach read, something with a happy ending, something maybe that would make me laugh. I guess those aren't the books that I'm initially drawn to. And so it maybe would have taken more of an effort to choose something like that. But I've also been thinking a lot about how hard it is to find well-written, funny books. So I'm going to talk about this a little bit more in my next video where I talk about my list for the coming year. I just feel like there's not enough to choose from. I could have read a romance because we all know that romance, like the definition of romance is everybody lives happily ever after. But because I don't read in that genre normally, I wasn't looking for it. It didn't fall into my lap. I would have had to have gone out and like sought it out and I didn't. It's just really interesting for me, like insight into my reading habits to realize how many kind of dark, depressing downers I choose to read. But also I think there's something to that. I think that that happens because that's what's valued in literary fiction. And somehow if somebody writes an uplifting, happy book, it's considered to be shallow in some way. And I think that's really misguided. So I'm going to do something a little bit different with this in my 2023 list, but stay tuned because I'm going to talk about that more in just a minute. So overall, I feel like I did pretty well with my reading goals for this year. I could always read more. I always wish at the end of the year that I had read more. And that's another thing I'm working on is like kind of paying attention to my schedule and allowing myself to sit down and read. I also listen to audiobooks, but I just have to pay more attention to making time for reading because it is hard to do. I'll also link below on that topic to my Substack newsletter in which I talk about that, how you find the time to read, because I know that's something that a lot of people struggle with, and maybe that'll be helpful to you as well. So up next, my video on my reading goals for 2023. If you like what you see here, please subscribe, click like, and I'll be back soon with another episode of Better Book Clubs.